Today I'm here with my friend Victoria, and we are going to talk all about what you can teach in your music classroom tomorrow. And today is about rounds. And we could have the conversation about what the difference between a round and a canon, and if there is one, another day, because that is not going to be the conversation. But today we are going to talk about rounds because I think when we think part work, we think rounds. And admittedly, this is not the first step for part work. This is actually kind of a later skill for part work. So if you have not listened to our episode on ostinati, there's probably some other stuff somewhere too, but that one jumps out at me for sure. That is a great place to start if you haven't had your students doing two different things at different times. This would not be, at least my recommendation. Victoria's nodding, so I assume she agrees with me. This would not be like the best place to start with like kindergarten part work. So this is going to be more like second, third grade at least type of stuff when we're talking about rounds, because it does take a little bit extra stuff, and there's some difficulties that come with doing rounds, some things to consider that we'll talk about all day today. So Victoria, what are your thoughts on rounds?
Love them. The one that everyone is probably the most familiar with, if students haven't done rounds before, then very often you might say that, maybe you've heard people do this with row, row, row your boat. And some kids, it depends on your setting. But some kids will be like, oh, yeah, I get that. Yeah. Rounds absolutely are one of the trickier things that we ask of young musicians. There's no question, which is why what you're saying about starting with like really solid unison and then getting into some other part work like beat versus rhythm. You mentioned the ostinati is like a great check to see if we can move on to some of these more advanced things. One of the things I love about rounds is when you start doing them, it's a very simple musical mechanism, but it makes everything sound so like grand and interesting, right? So even though it is very challenging for young musicians, it's one of those things that once students have it under their belts, anything else you do that you can turn into a round is automatically so much more elevated than just doing something in unison. So it's a great way to really impress admin and really impress your other colleagues, really impress parents, because they're like, oh my gosh, our kids are they'll use the word talented, and you'd be like, well, we can have the debate about talent, but that's fine. They're definitely singing it around. There's no question about that, right? So it makes everything sound so much cooler, and kids love it. They're like, we sound like a real choir. I'm like, that's because you are a real choir,
Yeah, and I want to point out what you mentioned about unison, and whether we're talking about singing rounds or we're talking about rhythmic rounds that you're doing with body percussion or just speech or clapping or whatever it might be, that unison piece is really, really important. I remember I haven't done as much choral study as I would like to, but when thinking about working with children's choirs, we always talk about how unison singing is the number one first thing that we want to be doing before we go to anything else, right? And then we move into like partner songs, which could be another episode, and ostinati and things like that. So, let's go ahead and dive on in, because we could probably just talk about the thing without actually doing the thing for a good long while. So I am going to go first today. I'm going to talk about Scotland's Burning, which my source for this is the purple book that I don't have in my hand. It's put out by Boosey, I want to say, and it is the 150 rounds to sing, play, do music with. Whatever, I forget the title. We'll link it somewhere. So the text for this, you can Wikipedia to your heart's content about the history. There's a version with London's burning, and this is the Scotland's Burning is about the burning of Edinburgh with Henry VIII in the 1500s and all that good stuff. So not good stuff, but you know what I'm trying to say. So you can look up the history and get into some of that as you wish. So I teach this song simply by singing it. So if you are not familiar, it goes like this. Scotland's burning, look out, fire, 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 pour on water. And it sounds like pretty jovial for what's happening. But the motions that I use are a simple pat, clap, pat, clap. I've also seen people go like, hand, like the Kevin McAllister, like hands on their cheeks, like, Scotland's burning. So let's do that one so that you can see it better. So Scotland's burning, and then look out. So like we're looking from a distance, look out, and then fire alarm, fire, 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 then pantomime, pour on water. So all together. What did I do with this? Scotland's burning, look out, fire, 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 pour on water, pour on water. And I like this song because the motions really help with what we're going to be doing with the round, right? So there's a number of different ways you could teach this. We don't necessarily need to go through each step. You could do it phrase by phrase with the motions. You could ask them to pick out the motions or the words that they notice, have them, kind of like smatter together whatever phrases, like, oh, let's do the fire first, or oh, let's do the pour on water, whatever, until we get to like those four, and then we can do it all together. So then for me, it's harder for kids to come in second on a round. So, and I think we've talked about this in the past, like when we get into part work, who goes first? How do we break this up? How do we sequence it? So if we can do it wonderfully in a unison, then what I like to do is start them, and then I am the second group. And then we flip it where I begin and they're the second group. And even in that instance, there has to be a pretty big prep, like a pretty big conducting motion, for lack of a better way to say it, to get them to come in and feel like they're self-starting. So I might begin like, Scotland's burning, Scotland's burning, Scotland's burning, like almost cut myself out. That was an obnoxious, horrible prep breath, but something obnoxious that they would notice, so that they would know to come in. Something else is if you're standing at the front of the room and your students are facing you, like in a grid or something, that might not be like the best position because they're not looking at each other. So moving into a circle for this is really, really effective. And then I just take myself out of the circle. And so they can hear what's happening, right? So maybe I'm even walking around the circle when I'm being the other part, so they could hear what's going on, but they're not necessarily getting distracted by my motions and looking to me as their leader, right? You could also like designate a student conductor if you wanted to, right? You could do it that way. So once they feel pretty solid, and again, this technically you could do all in one lesson, but it might spread out depending on where you feel like they're secure to go on to the next step, because maybe that's where we need to stop, because this is their first opportunity with rounds. And that's really challenging, and it needs to simmer a little bit. But if they're ready to go on, then you can move them into two circles, right? So then we have two groups, and I'm really playing the part of the conductor there, having this group start, the other group go second, and always having the opportunity to switch. So they're not getting comfortable in whatever role they've been given. And then you can move into 3, you can move into 4, all that good stuff. So ultimately, I want 4 circles starting out in the song. And then we can play around with form a little bit, right? So we can play around with this idea of maybe we just turn this into a clapping cannon. This is our round, however you want, whatever you want to say, a clapping exercise. This isn't like the most interesting necessarily, because it's just da, 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 da. It's a lot of quarter notes. So it's not super interesting. But maybe a better thing to do, particularly since the motions are so prevalent in this lesson, is to say, okay, like come up with your own motions for each motive. We have 4 different motions, have each group come up with their own thing, and then that gives them like an even greater sense of ownership when it's time for them to enter into the canon. And then one more possible extension of this is to think about your particular school, your particular city, and maybe you just kind of recompose some text. So this is horrible text that I came up with in like 5 minutes, but Spokane is like we have Bloomsday, and it's lilacs and all that kind of stuff. So like Spokane's blooming, lilacs, lilacs, purple, 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 pick some flowers, pick some flowers. Like you could do something like that. It could even help you write it, come up with some different pantomime motions, do it in the round. Could be super fun. So we learned song by rote. We made sure we really mastered the motions along with the text, because that's going to be such a great physical aid when we get into the round. We broke into 2 groups where the students started the first time we did any part work, because that's what they're used to, and then I came in second, and then we switch, put them in a circle so they can see each other. I'm kind of on the outside, then 2 circles, then 3 circles, then 4 circles. Then we start doing some more creative things where they come up with their own movements, and they come up with their own text as well.
Love it.
Scene.
Yes. Love it. Yeah. And that's a really beautiful way to sequence it, right? Making sure that we're not pushing students ahead so that everything flops. And sometimes, it's fine to flop. It's okay. But making sure that all of the scaffolds are absolutely in place. I like what you said about the motions are there kind of to help kids figure out where they are supposed to be, right? And another really valuable thing you said was, if you have your kids like in rows and they're looking at the one point, the teacher, number one, one, they are set up so well to follow the teacher in that instance. And that's a great thing for a lot of other classroom activities. But for something like a round, they need to really be able to listen around the room and not just follow whatever the teacher's doing. Because if they're only following the teacher, we can't sing in a round, right? Because you're playing or you're singing the second part. So thinking through like what's the physical formation of the class, that's a super valuable thing.
Yeah, and the other piece there, excuse me, is like I wanted to come up with some good extensions that didn't change like the character of what this is, just because like we could go to instruments, we could do so like we can change the motions, like the pantomime type motions, but I don't necessarily, for me in my classroom, I don't see this as a song that really extends to a lot of different other things. Like this is like a good round song. It's a good experience because of the physical nature of it, the kinesthetic reinforcement, and the opportunity for a little bit of creativity, but we're still focusing on singing, and we're still focusing on singing in a round. So it's a really, really good singing part work song for me. Not to say that we can't extend it, but there's enough extensions kind of where that remains the focus that's where I try to focus, I guess. So.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a great point. Not everything needs to be a full extended, like like in rondo form and adding rhythmic building blocks, right? And you and I, obviously, you and I love that kind of stuff. But like the magic of a round and the magic of just singing in community, like just with your physical body, just with your larynx, right? Like, and that's all we have to make this really beautiful music in, third grade. That's enough of a really beautiful experience in and of itself. And I think that's important to point out as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, for all the things we talk about, all the times we talk about like independent musicianship and creativity and making sure that students have a voice, like it's okay, for us to focus on singing beautifully in unison and then singing beautifully in a round and having that experience too, right? And that can feel as creative and as musical as other things too, because it's such a strong feeling of like belonging, right? So
okay, so let's continue hanging out in Western Europe, and let's take a trip over to Finland. Now, in Finland, and they have these big, gigantic trees, and all across the third grade room, we are making trees as big as we can with our bodies. And how big can you make your tree? Oh, yeah, that's excellent. Can you make your tree as tall as you can? Very nice. Now, what does your short tree look like? Maybe you have a short and wide tree. Maybe you have a short and narrow tree. And maybe you're just a tiny sapling. Let me see all the saplings all across the room. Okay, great. Now what we're going to do, this is the circle of life. Will you please get your saw out? Because we need a house. And we need furniture to sit on, and this is just how it goes. Okay, I'm singing, you are copying me. And the way we have our saw, and this is actually a gigantic 2-person saw. Did you know that? So right now, it's going to be me as one side, and the whole class is just copying me. But eventually, we will be in partners. Okay, here we go. Sahhaa Sahhaa poikki poo. Sahhaa Sahhaa poikki. Suuriks haloiks, pieniks paloiks, suuriks haloiks, pieniks paloiks, nusnia nisnia nu, nusnia nisnia nu, pukatu. And what do you think happens at the end of our sawing song?
The tree dies.
The tree falls down. Yes.
The circle of life.
That's exactly it. So Finland is a place that is absolutely known for its forests. Finland has forests that are like magical. It's in all of their folklore. It's in a lot of their modern media. You've heard of like Finnish design being a big deal, and that's because a lot of it comes from this carpentry practice in Finland. So trees and the practice of forestry is a really big deal in Finland. The reason I give this spiel on the front end is that there are some silly words that are going to get changed around if you don't set the context at the beginning, which is just one of the things that happens when we don't sing in English. It's fine. Everyone will sing Pikachu at the end, and you'll let them do their Pikachu thing until someone gets tired of it, and then the kids will correct themselves, and you just let that play out, and it's fine. So eventually, students are going to be doing their sawing motions with a partner. Now, the other thing that we can do with this song is, let me back up one second. This is sourced from the greatest place on the internet called nordicsounds.info. And I'm going to give that source before I forget to mention it. And we'll link it in the show notes as well, because they have the most wonderful website that I could rant and rave about for years, and I probably will. But they have a lot of resources for using this song in a classroom setting. One of the things that they have kids do is also you stand up and you're going to saw off like in your middle, and then at the end you fall down to your knees. And then at the end of the next round, you fall down on the floor. So you're like creating your tree, like making your tree fall down lower and lower and lower. Okay, so now we've been doing the song for a while. Sahhaa Sahhaa boy keep on. So now we're all in our forest of trees in partners, because remember, this is a 2-person saw. With the class in their little forest, I will be in my little forest over here on the other side of the room. So they start first, and then I would come in second in that round. And then eventually I would say I'm the lumberjack coming around to tag some trees, and I tag a few trees to come over to my side and everything like that. So that's kind of how this activity can be moved from one big forest to eventually splitting the forest in half. And then eventually I'm not in there at all. The nice thing, going back to your point about the movements with Scotland's Burning, the nice thing about this is we have the sawing motion that kind of matches the song, but with each new phrase, our sawing motion is going faster and faster, or rather, the tempo stays the same. Our sawing motion gets shorter and shorter, so we are like cutting the sawing time in half. So because the reason I love this song for working in a round is that back to this idea of independent musicianship or interdependent musicianship, in order for us to sing in a round, we need to have the same steady pulse, even though we're going to have to be subdividing at different places in the song and everything like that. So having this big pulse moving to the smaller pulse, and then when we get to the nustia nista nu, those are the tiny pulses, and then finally, the tree is falling down at the end. All of those motions help line us up vertically, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, and you think about it, if we, in the purple or pink or magenta book, there's an asterisk every song showing you where you're supposed to come in, and so kids need that scaffold differently, right? And as you're probably catching on, as seems apparent, kinesthetic tends to be the way that the kids can really get that, right? Like, what do we do with steady beat? We feel it in our bodies. What do we do with rhythm? We want to find a place to feel it in our bodies. So finding a place where that formal element comes in, where we know we're going to start on that next motive or the next phrase, is really, really helpful. So aside from the pulse, right? Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and just to yes and that and link it back to this song. This is a half note song for me. And again, it's this idea of an elongated sound, but the steady beat doesn't change. So exactly what you were saying with that kinesthetic element. Yeah.
Yeah. Love that. Yeah, it's kind of a cool diminution song too. That's hard for me to say.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. It's got all of your augmentation, all of your diminution stuff in there. Yeah, and it's so cool. Yeah. This is a separate thing, but it's really exciting for second graders to do this kind of stuff, right? Because the point of the song is not augmentation and diminution, right? The point of the song is not even singing it in a round, right? The point of the song is Finland has a lot of trees and forests are very important in Finland, right? But within that, there's so much cool stuff to extract, for sure.
Yeah, I love it. Cool. Yeah. So a couple of kind of key takeaways. Just the idea that getting kids in physical space, like whether it's in their forests or their circles, to kind of have their teammates alongside of them when we're breaking kids into part work is really, really meaningful. I think you see this even if we were doing something that wasn't a round, that was 2 parts. You kind of put kids in 2 separate groups. If they're in the same, using the same instruments, you'd put them close to each other, right? So we want to do that same type of thing. This idea of giving them lots of opportunity to practice before making it more refined into a group. So like you have the partners, but I'm sure you would do that like in a full group setting, and then you've had your own separate forest, and it would look very similar to the way that I described. But again, and then finding those prompts or those kinesthetic cues that allow students to stay lined up vertically. So yeah,
Yes.
so really think about that kinesthetic reinforcement and those spatial relationships within the classroom community, which are maybe two things you wouldn't think about when you're talking about singing around, right? But are so very, very important. So, and unison first.
Yes.
Unison first.
Love it. Yeah. So unison, listening to each other. Everyone has a place in the community. And sometimes if you just sing a song in a round, that's absolutely enough.